Well, it's good to be with all of you here at End Times with Pastor Eric. I've got a doozy of a message here for you today. We're going to be looking at our third installment of Understanding the Day of the Lord. And remember, we're wrestling with that question, are there signs before the Day of the Lord? And I'm going to show you again, my central thesis is no, there are not. There are no signs prior to the parousia. Remember the relationship between the parousia, the technical term for the coming of Christ, and the Day of the Lord. What I'm claiming is the parousia, the technical term for Christ's coming, is synonymous with the 70th week of Daniel. And I've proven that in earlier messages, and I will continue to hit that in future messages. So the parousia is related to the day of the Lord because the beginning of the parousia, the coming of Christ, is the beginning of the broad day of the Lord. The broad day of the Lord begins at the inception of the parousia, the rapture, and it extends on into eternity. And remember, I've said that the broad day of the Lord is the time in which God finally and forever saves his people and finally and forever judges his enemies. Why do I give that definition? I'm very particular about that definition. The reason why I give that definition is the moment we are raptured as the church and given our resurrected bodies. Remember, Paul says, comfort therefore one another. Why? Because you will always be with the Lord. 1 Thessalonians 4:15 through 18. So at that point, we're going to be in our resurrected bodies. We'll never sin or rebel against our God anymore. We will always be in the presence of Christ, always protected, never to be those who suffer again. That's what I mean by you and I are finally and forever saved. That is, we fully realize all of the promises. We're always with Christ. Whether we're in heaven or on earth, whether it's the millennial kingdom or the eternal states, you and I are going to be reigning with Christ, glorified bodies, never to fear, never to suffer, never to sin. That's the way it's going to be. It all begins with the rapture of the church. Okay, but what about the wrath upon the enemies of God? Well, that begins inside the 70th week of Daniel, and it gets worse and worse. Okay, but what's more is when you get to the white throne judgment, which happens between the millennium and the eternal states, then every unbeliever will be sentenced to the lake of fire. And how long do they go through that? Forever. They go through that forever. So that's why I say, beginning at the parousia, the broad day of the Lord, it's the salvation of God's people finally and forever, and it's the beginning of the judgment of God's enemies finally and forever. That's the broad day of the Lord. It begins here at the beginning of the parousia and extends on into eternity. There are no signs prior to it. There's not one single sign in the church age that you are given as to when this parousia, the rapture, and the ensuing wrath of the 70th week of Daniel will break forth. There's not one. Every single sign, let me say it again, every single sign Jesus gives in the Olivet Discourse is found inside the 70th week of Daniel. For example, Matthew 24:15, Jesus says, so when you see the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, where in the world is that? Well, that's here at the midpoint of the final 7 years. It's not in the church age. Jesus says in Matthew 24:21 through 22, he says there'll be tribulation that will come upon the world such as never occurred nor ever will, meaning it's the worst time period ever. Well, that's not during the church age. Why? Because during the church age, you don't lose a third of the oceans turning to blood. You don't lose a third of humanity being killed by a demonic horde. You don't have a third of all ships being destroyed. You don't have a quarter of the earth's population being devastated by sword, famine, pestilence, wild beasts. These are things that are occurring inside the 70th week of Daniel. Okay, so every single sign is inside the 70th week of Daniel. And so that's why I say there are signs inside the parousia that is prior to what we call the narrow day of the Lord. Dear ones, if you haven't seen the last message, you ought to look at that first. There I lay out the difference between the broad day of the Lord, the day of the Lord that begins at the inception of the parousia and extends forever, and the narrow day of the Lord, which is that 24-hour period, that unique day in which Christ will come and judge the enemies surrounding Jerusalem. That battle is alluded to in Joel chapter 3, in Zechariah chapter 14. Okay? Now, what I show is that there are two texts in the Bible that seem to indicate that there are signs or precursors prior to the day of the Lord. That's found in Malachi 4:5 and 2 Thessalonians 2:1 through 3. And what I'm showing is that in both cases, the signs that those allude to are inside the parousia prior to the narrow day of the Lord, but they are not prior to the broad day of the Lord. So all those signs that you'll see in these two texts occur inside the parousia, not prior to it. That's my central thesis, and I'll be proving the second point of this from 2 Thessalonians 2. I already addressed Malachi 4:5 last time. So with that, we've got a lot to cover regarding 2 Thessalonians 2. What I'm about to share with you gets into some technical discussions about Greek and logic, but bear with me. I'll make it understandable so that you, perhaps who are only an English reader of the text of Scripture, will be able to understand what the basic issue is with 2 Thessalonians 2, 1 through 3. My claim is not that there is any problem with our Bible, that is the Greek text, but what I am claiming is there's been some misunderstanding, I believe, in our English translations. So I'm not criticizing the Greek inspired text that was given to us by the Spirit and by the biblical writer. What I am complaining about is the way some of our English translations have rendered what's called an apostasy. So let's get into it. Let me explain what the issue was. Now, before I read this, remember, at Thessalonica, this church was in fear that they were living inside the day of the Lord, not prior to it. Okay, not that it was going to break forth at any time, but they thought they were in it. They were inside the day of the Lord. Why? Because teachers claiming to be the Apostle Paul or representing Paul had written letters to that effect. Listen to how Paul has to quench their fears. He says, "Now we request you, brethren, with regard to the coming," remember the term coming here is actually parousia. I'll explain the significance of that in a moment. "Regard to the parousia of our Lord Jesus Christ and our gathering together to him, that you not be quickly shaken from your composure or be disturbed either by a spirit or a message or a letter as if from us, to the effect that the day of the Lord has come. Let no one in any way deceive you, for it will not come unless the apostasy comes first and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction." Now, first thing I want to point out in the text is I want you to see the relationship between the parousia, again, that's the Greek term for the coming of Christ, and what? The day of the Lord. Okay, that's what I was showing you on the previous slide. The parousia is a complex event. It's synonymous with the 70th week of Daniel, the last 7 years, which is still in our future. Okay, so here I'm trying to help you put your data together. There's a relationship between that parousia and what? The day of the Lord. Okay, so I'm just putting the data together for you. That's why I'm telling you the beginning of the broad day of the Lord is the beginning of the parousia. That's what I'm showing you. Okay? Now, what were they concerned with? Well, they thought they had gotten a letter from Paul to the effect that the day of the Lord had come. Now, I'm not real wild even with what you see in red, this verb, which is a perfect active indicative. It's anestiken. It's rendered here not in error by the English translator, but it could be clearer. Notice how the English translation here, this is the New American Standard Bible, the one version that I typically use when I'm putting verses on the screen before you. It renders it has come. But I would render the has come, which is from the Greek verb anestiken. Again, it's a perfect active indicative verb. I would render it is present because it's clarifying. And because that verb or its participle form in the perfect is always rendered as present everywhere else in the New Testament. Where else? Everywhere else. Let me show you some examples. 1 Corinthians 7:26, Paul's talking about whether a person should be remain single or married. And he says, this is good in view of the present distress. For our purposes, notice the term present comes from the same verb, anestiken, which is rendered here, has come. What I'm claiming is present is better. That they were worried that the day of the Lord was present. Okay, so the way I would render this if I were writing the Eric Dauma version, it would be as if from us to the effect that the day of the Lord is present. That's how I would render it. Okay, let me show you some other examples. Galatians 1:4, regarding Christ, he might rescue us from this present evil age. Okay, anestiken, same verb. It might be the participle form, but it's either the participle form or the verbal form that's in the perfect tense. Again, it's present. Let me give you another example, Hebrews 9:9, which is a symbol, he says, for the present time. All of these are rendering anestiken, and what I'm claiming is that's the proper translation. It clarifies the issue. It's not that has come is wrong, it just doesn't clarify. The issue was the people at Thessalonica thought the day of the Lord was present. Again, the way it should be rendered is that they were in fear that the day of the Lord is present. That's the fear. Now, why is that important to the discussion of this text? Because notice here, when we get to verse 3, notice he says, let no one in any way deceive you, for it will not come. Do you see where it says it will not come? That's in bold. But notice it's also italicized. The reason it's italicized by our New American Standard Bible translators rightly is because it is not original to the Greek text. It has to be supplied by the English translators. This is called the apostasy construction of Paul's argument. Okay, now what you might say, what in the world is an apostasy? Well, in both grammar and in logic, we have something called a protasis apostasy construction. The protasis is the if portion, the conditional portion of a statement. The apostasy construction is the then. Here, the apostasy is actually thrown forward prior to the protasis, which is the conditional language, which you see here. So normally you have an if then, it goes protasis, apostasy. Here, Paul wants you to supply the apostasy before he supplies the protasis. Okay, so what I'm claiming is that unless the apostasy comes first, that is, in fact, in the Greek text. But what is not in the Greek text, which Paul is relying upon you, the English translator, supplying, is what you find in bold. And this is what I have an issue with regarding our English translations. Why? Listen carefully. Please don't glaze over. Please get this. If you get this, you'll understand the issue. Notice Paul was recognizing their fear. The fear up in verse 2 was that the day of the Lord was present. Not that it was coming, not that it may be imminent or at hand. Remember I said over and over and over, this verb is present. The way it should be rendered is, they thought that the day of the Lord is present. But notice all of a sudden our English translators switch from something that's present to something that's future. It will not come. That's the fundamental problem with our English translations. Again, I'm not complaining about the inspired Greek text because this is being supplied by English translators. What I am saying is they are breaking the logic that Paul has. What should be supplied here in this apostasy is that it is not present. Why? Because that's building off of the logic that Paul had, that the day of the Lord is present. That's what their fear was. So again, they thought the day of the Lord is present. What Paul is saying is, let no one in any way deceive you, for it is not present unless the apostasy comes first. That's first thing inside the day of the Lord, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction. So again, what I'm showing you is the logic of the English translators fails what Paul is conveying. It's not a failure of the scriptures, it's a failure of our English translators who have engaged, in my humble opinion, in great groupthink when they render this apostasy that must be supplied by the translator, it will not come. Now, as I say that, I know some of you are thinking, wait a minute, Eric, are you claiming that Paul is relying upon a translator to put in something for the understanding of our text? Yes, and it's not unknown to us. For example, let's say I told my son, or I asked him, will you come with me to the store? And he's arguing with me, I don't want it for this reason. And I finally, later in our conversation, just a couple minutes later, I said, come on, why don't you come with me? Do I have to supply, again, saying, why don't you come with me to the store? Or is it okay to say, why don't you come with me? It's fine to say, why don't you come with me? Because I know he can supply, as the translator of what I'm saying, that within context, I'm referring to going to the store. Okay, that's exactly what Paul is doing. So he's assuming that you understand logically that the issue is whether the day of the Lord was present or not present. And so you can't all of a sudden go from a present issue, the day of the Lord is present, and switch it to a future-oriented issue. That's illogical. It's not that it will not come. It should be rendered, it is not present. That's the issue. So let me reiterate what the issue is. The logic of 2 Thessalonians 2, 2 through 3 is as follows. Again, what I'm saying is in verse 3 of 2 Thessalonians 2, there is a protasis, apostasy construction. Okay? Now, if you take a logic course, I've taught logic in the past. I've actually taught it a few times. You'll recognize that in logic, you have something called a hypothetical syllogism, where you have an if this, then that. And so in logic, the protasis is called the antecedent, and the apostasis is called the consequent. Okay? But typically, grammarians, those who are writing, for example, commentaries, when we're dealing with grammar and syntax, they refer to the if portion as the protasis, and the then portion as the apostasis. What I'm claiming is in 2 Thessalonians 2:3, if you could look at the Greek, if you're a Greek reader, if you understand the text, you'll notice that the apostasis is actually thrown forward, and then Paul supplies the protasis. So if you only read English, that's okay. I'm telling you what the issues are. So what I'm claiming is that the apostasis is thrown forward, which isn't unusual, and that must be supplied by the English translator. And what I'm claiming to you is that apostasis, the then portion that must be supplied by the English translation, is wrong. It takes a present issue and all of a sudden throws it into a future-oriented issue. That's the breakdown in our English translations. Okay? Now, second thing I want you to see here, again, is that the apostasis is thrown forward and is not original to the Greek. It must be supplied by the translator. Paul assumes this will be done correctly. What I'm claiming is in our English translations, they are not supplying that apostasis correctly. Again, remember what Paul's issue was. The people at Thessalonica thought that they were inside the day of the Lord. They thought the day of the Lord was present. Remember, anestiken, that's verse 2 of 2 Thessalonians 2. Okay, all of a sudden the English translators switched to an apostasis with a future-oriented idea. It will not come. Why the will? It's not a will come, it's they thought they were in it. That's what's being supplied incorrectly. That's what I'm showing you. The logic starts to break down. All right, now I'm going to put this all together for you, I promise you. Number 3, the logic is built off of the red, notice here, to the effect that the day of the Lord is present. Remember, that was the end of verse 2 of 2 Thessalonians 2. What did the people at Thessalonica think? They thought the day of the Lord was present. They thought they were inside of it. That's the issue. So, notice the way the apostasis should be rendered is this way. It is not present unless the apostasy comes first. Okay? Our English translations say it will not come unless the apostasy comes first. That is incorrect. So as I unpack this, what you'll find is that Paul was not saying that the apostasy comes before the day of the Lord, but rather it is the first thing within the day of the Lord. That's what I'm driving to. Okay, that's what you're going to see so clearly in this text once we put it all together. So what I'm showing you, this would be my translation of it. Or excuse me, this is not my translation yet. This is still the English version. Notice the English version, 2 Thessalonians 2, 2 through 3, says that you not be quickly shaken from your composure, or be disturbed either by spirit or a message or a letter as if from us, to the effect that the day of the Lord is present. Okay, now I supplied is present. Remember I said that's the way it should be rendered. But notice what our English translations do. They say, let no one in any way deceive you, for it will not come. Why are they switching to a future-oriented apostasis when the issue was a present concern? Okay, what I'm saying is that when it says it will not come, it should actually be rendered, it is not present. That's what I'm saying. If you're going to be logically consistent. Again, Paul is assuming, look at number 2. Paul assumes that the apostasis will be done correctly. Is it being done correctly? Is present the same thing as something that will not come? No. Will has to do with the future. Present is about right now. Okay, that's what I'm showing you, that there's a breakdown in the logic of the text. And as we go through the rest of this message, what I'm going to show you is that when it comes to the apostasy coming first, it is not prior to the day of the Lord. It is the first thing inside the day of the Lord. That's what this logic is going to end up driving you to. Okay? Now, let's go on. The question I would be answering here is, are the signs prior to or first thing in the day of the Lord? In other words, what I'm asking is, are the signs the apostasy before the parousia, which is the beginning of the day of the Lord, or is it the first thing in? I'm claiming it's the first thing in. Because the apostasy is where the whole world gives their allegiance to the man of lawlessness. That's why it says the apostasy comes first and the man of lawlessness is revealed. That's why the opening seals, the very first seal in Revelation chapter 6 is what? The man of lawlessness on the scene. The Antichrist goes about. Okay, why? Because there's been an apostasy. So remember, dear ones, back in Genesis chapter 11, the beginning of the world rebelled against God and they built what? They built Babylon. Instead of having many governments, they had one government. That's going to happen again, where in the parousia, the 70th week of Daniel, all of the nations are going to give their allegiance to the one man, the man of lawlessness, the beast of Revelation chapter 13. That's what's going to happen. And at the midpoint of this time period, he'll declare himself to be God in Israel's temple. And he'll be destroyed by Christ at the end of it, as Jesus destroys the enemies surrounding Jerusalem. That's what I'm claiming. So the first thing Paul's pointing out is inside the parousia is the apostasy. The world giving their allegiance, building Babylon, as it were, again, the second time. Okay? That's what's going on. So let's read it again. This is the way it should be rendered. 2 Thessalonians 2, 2-3, Paul says that he does not want them to be quickly shaken from their composure or disturbed either by a spirit or a message or a letter, as if from us to the effect that the day of the Lord is present. That's the issue. They thought they were present inside this time period. Then he says, let no one in any way deceive you. And now here's the correct logic of the apostasis. Now again, this is my version, but this is the way it should be rendered. For it is not present. Okay, in other words, you're not inside this time period unless what? Unless the apostasy comes first, which is the first thing inside the parousia, and the man of lawlessness is real, the son of destruction. The man of lawlessness is the Antichrist who comes on the scene, the very first seal, the beginning of the 70th week of Daniel. Okay, that's the way we should understand the text. Okay, all right. Now, what I'm going to show you is that there are two identical Greek constructions elsewhere in the Bible that have the same Greek construction that we have in 2 Thessalonians 2, 2-3. And there's three words that are identical. There's conditional language, in, which is a conjunction, it means unless. There's an adverb, may, which is not or no. And then there's proton, first. Those three terms are unique in 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 3. But you find them two other places, in Mark 3:27 and in John 7:51. Now, why am I laboring these two texts? Don't glaze over. Please stay with me. What I'm going to show you is that both in Mark 3:27 and John 7:51, the same constructions that we have as we have in 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 3, show us that what happens first is not prior to an event, but the first thing inside of an event. In other words, I'm going to show you corroboration that the apostasy coming first is not the first thing prior to the day of the Lord, but the first thing inside the day of the Lord. Let me say that again. Both Mark 7:27 and John 7:51 are going to give us corroboration that whatever Paul is talking about here regarding the apostasy coming first, that it occurs inside the parousia, not prior to the parousia or the day of the Lord. That's how I'm going to be showing you. Okay, so let me put up what we have here in Mark 3:27. Again, the same Greek construction that you have in 2 Thessalonians 2:2. And notice here in Mark 3:27, Jesus here is talking about the plundering of the strong man. Remember, he is the one, Jesus, who was plundering Satan because he was able to cast out the demons. He was showing his authority. And remember, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the scribes, they were always claiming that Jesus did his miracles by the power of Beelzebul, Satan, rather than the power of the Spirit or the power of God. And so that's what Jesus is reacting against. So notice here, Mark 3:27, Jesus says, "But no one can enter the strong man's house and plunder his property unless he first binds the strong man, and then he will plunder his house." Now, first thing you have to realize is that the strong man is more than likely inside his house. That's where he is envisioned to be in Mark 3:27. So where is the strong man? Well, he's in his house. Okay, now why is that important? Because the binding, therefore, is the first part of the process of entering and plundering. In other words, the binding of the strong man doesn't happen before the entering and the plundering. It is the first event inside of it. Are you with me? In the same way, the apostasy does not come before the day of the Lord. It is the first event inside of the day of the Lord. That's what I'm showing you. Okay, we see another example, John 7:51. Here, I believe it was Nicodemus standing up, or not Nicodemus, maybe it was, I think it was Nicodemus. It was one of the Pharisees, if I recall, that in fact stood up for Jesus and said, wait a minute. John 7:51, he says, "Our law does not judge a man unless it first hears from him and knows what he is doing, does it?" Okay, so the point that this Pharisee is making as he's sticking up for Jesus is that, wait a minute, we can't just engage in the judgment process without first hearing from the witness. But what you have to see is that the hearing of the witness didn't precede the judgment process, but it was the first event within the judgment process. So there's a judgment process. What's the first thing in it? You hear from the witness. That's the first event inside the judging process. Okay, what's the first thing you do in a judging process in Israel? You hear from the witness. It doesn't precede the judgment process. It is the first thing inside the judgment process. In the same way, dear brothers and sisters, the apostasy doesn't come before the day of the Lord. It is the first thing inside the day of the Lord. So what I'm claiming is that both Mark 3:27, the construction of me, of een, and of proton for first, that's what you have in 2 Thessalonians 2:2 and Mark 3:27 and John 7:51. All three of these texts have to do with something that occurs first thing inside of the event, whether it's the day of the Lord or the entering and binding or the judgment process. It is not prior to the process. Okay, so let me try to put that together here. The hearing of the accused was the first part of the process of judging. That's what I'm claiming. So let me put this all together. What I'm claiming is that all three texts, whether it's 2 Thessalonians 2:2 through 3, or it's Mark 3:27, or it's John 7:51, is that none of those things declare that there's something that happens prior to the process, but it's the first thing inside the process. So instead of parousia here, I want you to think of the process of entering and plundering in Mark 3:27. What I'm claiming to you is that when Jesus says you have to first bind the strong man, binding of the strong man does not occur prior to the entering and the plundering. It is the first thing inside the entering and the plundering. Why? Because that's where you find the strong man. It's in his house. Okay, how about John 7:51? Remember, John 7:51 says that we don't first enter into the judgment process without first hearing our witness. The hearing of the witness doesn't precede the judgment process. It is the first thing in the judgment process. That's what I'm claiming. And what I'm also claiming then is that the apostasy that comes first doesn't come prior to the day of the Lord. It is the first thing inside the day of the Lord. And so what Paul was saying is, if you in fact were inside the day of the Lord, if the day of the Lord were present, well, then you would be seeing the apostasy in the whole world give their allegiance to the man of lawlessness. Are you seeing that? Well, of course not. Well, then therefore, they're not inside the day of the Lord. That's what he's saying. And that's why the logic of the text is important, that the day of the Lord is not present Unless what? Unless first you have the apostasy, which is the first thing inside, and the man of lawlessness is revealed. That's the logic of the text. Again, 2 Thessalonians 2, 2 through 3, Paul says that you not be quickly shaken from your composure or be disturbed either by a spirit or a message or a letter as if from us, to the effect that the day of the Lord is present. Let no one in any way deceive you. Remember, they think that they're present, that they're inside this time period. He says, let no one in any way deceive you, for it is not present unless the apostasy comes first. Aha! The apostasy would be the first thing inside this rascal, inside the parousia, inside the day of the Lord. And then, of course, immediately comes the man of lawlessness being revealed. Why? Because the whole world apostatize and gives their allegiance to him inside, not prior. Notice the screen, but inside. First thing inside. That's the idea. Okay? Now, why is this such a superior reading? Brothers and sisters, I hope you haven't glazed over. Listen carefully. There are liberal scholars today that will claim that 2 Thessalonians 2, 2 through 3 could not have been written by Paul. Do you know why they say that? Let me put up another passage that Paul writes. There is now no contradiction with 1 Thessalonians 5:2. Let me explain why. Whoops. By the way, this should be 1 Thessalonians 5:2. I apologize. There's a typo there. I didn't see it until I just put it up here. But notice here, 1 Thessalonians 5:2. It says, for you yourselves know full well that the day of the Lord will come just like a thief. Remember, the term thief there is the term kleptes. There's two terms in the Greek text in the New Testament for a robber or a thief. There's leistes, which is a robber who beats you over the head with a club to get what he wants. He uses force. That is not the term that's used here. The term is kleptes. Many of you, again, have heard the term kleptomaniac. That's someone who can't stop stealing. It comes from the root term kleptes in Greek. The kleptes, the thief that's envisioned here, is one that uses stealth to steal what they want. Okay, so they don't use force, they use stealth. So the reason Paul is using that, and Jesus uses the same thing in Matthew 24, that his parousia comes like a thief. Remember, they're synonymous, the day of the Lord, right? The beginning of the parousia is the beginning of the day of the Lord. Why do both Jesus and Paul say it comes like a thief? They're not saying it comes violently, although it will be violent, of course, for the unregenerate as they incur God's wrath. But the point is it comes in a stealthy way, meaning there's no precursor, there's no sign to tip you off as to when it will occur. Now, the reason why liberal scholars claim that, again, this is 1 Thessalonians 5:2. I apologize, there's a typo there. The reason why they say 1 Thessalonians 5:2 and 2 Thessalonians 2, 2 through 3 can't be written by the same person is because the liberal theologians will say, well, the day of the Lord here has a precursor, namely the apostasy comes prior to it. Look on the screen, that's what they would claim. Well, here Paul is saying, again, 1 Thessalonians 5:2, that the day of the Lord comes like a thief without any precursor. Therefore, there would be a contradiction between 1 Thessalonians 5:2 and 2 Thessalonians 2:3. Okay, 2, 2 through 3. So what I'm showing you, though, is in our proper understanding of the text, there's no contradiction at all. Why? Because the apostasy coming first is the first thing inside the parousia. It doesn't precede the parousia. It is the first thing inside the day of the Lord. It does not precede the day of the Lord. That's what I'm claiming. That's the logic of the text. And all of a sudden, now we don't have a contradiction between 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 2 through 3, and again, 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 2, that indeed the day of the Lord comes just like a thief. Let me ask you, when a thief comes, do they give you a sign prior to their coming? Do they say, you know what, I can't steal from you unless first you see a black Chevrolet in the street, or a blue Mercedes, or whatever the case may be? No, they don't give you any precursor. That's the problem with these thieves, is they come suddenly without any warning. That's the idea with the day of the Lord. The apostasy coming first does not precede the day of the Lord. It is the first thing inside the day of the Lord. And therefore the day of the Lord can come like what? A thief with no precursor. If some thief told you, hey, I can't come unless you first of all have my car out in the street and it's after 11 o'clock. Well, what you would do is you would have 911 in your speed dial. You'd be eating your tuna fish sandwich and you'd be loaded up with your shotgun, all ready to go. When you saw those signs, then you would know, hey, it's after 11, I see the car, the thief is going to break in. They don't do that. They don't give you a precursor. They don't give you a sign. That's the way the day of the Lord is. Brothers and sisters, Paul is not contradicting himself. The apostasy coming first and the man of lawlessness is the first thing inside the day of the Lord. That's what Paul is clearly teaching. Remember, they thought the day of the Lord was present. He's saying to them, hey, if it was present, the first thing you'd see is the whole world giving their allegiance to the man of lawlessness as he comes on the scene of history. Do you see that? No. Why? Because in Paul's day, there were many governments, many nations, many people. They all hadn't given their allegiance to just one man. Okay? So again, he's saying, well, that you can't be inside the day of the Lord. That's how he was quenching their fears. By the way, some of you might be asking the question, why didn't Paul simply say, well, hey, you have not been raised from the dead? That is, you haven't received your rapture yet. Well, the reason he doesn't say that is because that's what they had feared they'd missed. Okay, so that would be what we call a tautology. Okay, listen carefully. If they believe that they missed the rapture and they're inside the day of the Lord, if Paul said, well, no, because you didn't miss the rapture and therefore you can't be in the day of the Lord, he doesn't add anything to the argument. That's called a tautology. It'd be like if my son asked me, hey, Dad, why does the sky look blue? And I say, well, because it looks blue. I haven't added anything to the argument. That's a tautology. Now, we have to ask ourselves if post-tribulationalism is correct, that the rapture happens at the end of the parousia, at the end of the 70th week of Daniel, then why wouldn't the Thessalonians, why wouldn't those at Thessalonica be absolutely ecstatic? Because if they were inside the day of the Lord, inside this parousia, they would know they're only literally years from the return of Christ to rapture them. Well, no, they were absolutely frightened out of their mind. Why? Because they figured they had missed the rapture and that they were incurring God's wrath because the persecution was so severe in the area of Asia Minor and Thessalonica. So again, Paul has to say, well, no. The first thing inside the day of the Lord is in fact the apostasy, the whole world giving its allegiance to the Antichrist, that is the man of lawlessness, and the rise and revelation of the man of lawlessness. Well, the whole world hadn't done that, therefore they couldn't be inside the parousia. If Paul said, no, you didn't miss the rapture because you didn't miss the rapture, he's doing a tautology. He's adding nothing to the argument. But ask your post-tribulationalist friends, hey, why is it that the people at Thessalonica weren't absolutely ecstatic that they thought they were inside the day of the Lord, since the rapture would only therefore, at worst case, be 7 years away? Why wouldn't they be absolutely ecstatic? It shows you that, again, they didn't believe in a post-tribulational rapture. They believed it was here. Notice on the screen, they believed it was the beginning, and they thought they had missed it. That's the issue. And they thought, therefore, they were inside the day of the Lord because they were incurring such great persecution. Brothers and sisters, when you start unpacking the data of the Scriptures, there's no contradiction. No, the day of the Lord doesn't come like a thief and not like a thief at the same time in the same relationship. That's a contradiction. When we get our understanding of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 2 through 3 correct, and realize the apostasy is the first thing inside the day of the Lord, not preceding the day of the Lord, then all of a sudden we're cooking with gas. Now we're understanding the Scriptures. Now we're understanding why the rapture is imminent in the day of the Lord, why there's no signs that precede it. There are no contradictions in Scriptures, brothers and sisters, but there is wayward thinking and faulty thinking even in our translation teams giving us our English Bibles. Okay, and I don't say that lightly, but I'm showing you the clarity of what the Greek text is showing us. And that you can't go from a present is here to a future it will not come and maintain logical consistency to the text of Scripture. What I'm advocating is true scholarship in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 2 through 3. And if you get it down right, There is no contradiction between, again, 1 Thessalonians, I apologize for the typo, 5:2, and what Paul is saying here. The day of the Lord does indeed come like a thief, without any warning, without any precursor, without any signs at all. Brothers and sisters, you and I are living in the church age. Where we are in this age, we don't know. Are we 5 years from the parousia? 5 minutes? 500 years? 5 months? 5 seconds? We have no idea. Why? Because it's coming like a thief. And that's why every single person ought to repent and believe upon the Lord Jesus Christ. The only people, whether you're Jew or Gentile, who will be saved and spared from this coming wrath are those who come to faith in Jesus Christ and are spared from the wrath to come. Today is the day. If you're watching this and for some reason, I don't know why an unbeliever would watch this, but if you're watching this, you're an unbeliever, today is the day to repent and come to faith in Jesus Christ, because this future day of the Lord is coming without warning. It's coming like a thief in the night. Thanks for watching. I hope we catch you next time in understanding the terms regarding the day of the Lord as we look further at these great doctrines of the faith. We'll catch you next time on End Times with Pastor Eric.